I'm driving in a borough of London within ULEZ. ULEZ meaning ultra low emissions zone. If my vehicle is not considered ultra low emissions, I have to pay a daily charge of £12.50 to drive here. This is the bit you're going to find probably a bit strange and maybe unexpected. This is a 2014 Porsche Cayman GTS. It has a big engine. Around town, it uses 2 to 3 times the amount of fuel and emits 2 to 3 times the amount of CO2 compared to your average car. Yet when I go on the ULEZ website, it says this is considered an ultra low emissions vehicle. I don't have to pay the charge. In fact, I'm helping keep London's air clean. Whereas somebody else who has a far more economical car, probably diesel, that may emit a quarter of the CO2 that this does around town, well, they may have to pay the charge. So why is that? That's what I'm going to explain in this video. If you don't know anything about ULEZ, it's the ultra low emission zone for London. It includes all London boroughs, including the City of London, and it's designed to try and clean up London's air by reducing emissions from vehicles. If your vehicle does not comply with ULEZ standards, you have to pay £12.50 per day to drive within a ULEZ area. To find out whether or not your vehicle complies with ULEZ standards, you need to go onto the ULEZ website and type in your registration number to find out if your vehicle is compliant and whether or not you need to pay the charge. But for a rough idea, if you have a diesel that was registered before 2015, 2016, then it may not be compliant. And if you have a petrol that was registered before 2005, 2006, then that may also not be compliant. £12.50 may not sound like a lot of money, but you've got to remember this is per day, every day except Christmas Day. It adds up. It adds up to £4,500 a year if you use your car on a daily basis within a ULEZ area. £4,500, well, that's more than many people spend on motoring in general over the year. £4,500 is enough to cover the cost of many people's car depreciation, their road tax, their car insurance, their servicing, their MOT, their fuel, their repairs. So a £4,500 bill to drive your car within ULEZ, well, that makes keeping that car uneconomically viable for many people. That's why when ULEZ was introduced and then expanded, many people changed their cars. Now I'm going to try and explain why this Porsche doesn't have to pay the ULEZ charge, but my old learner car, my old Seat Ibiza I had from between 2010 and 2014 before I got my current learner car, which is the Leon, that people who view this channel may recognise. That old Ibiza was a 1.6 TDI, 1.6 diesel, and around town it would comfortably emit a third of the CO2 that this Porsche emits. The reason why this Porsche doesn't have to pay the charge is because it's not about CO2. And that's because even though CO2 is harmful to humans, the level we have in the atmosphere is not currently directly harmful to humans. To give you an idea, in the year 2000, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere was 0.037%. Today, it's around about 0.042%. That's a big increase over 25, 26 years. That is a worry because CO2 is a greenhouse gas. It does affect the climate, but it's still far off from being at a level where it can directly affect humans. It needs to be closer to 0.1% before it directly starts to affect human health. So if we were trying to lower CO2 to try and improve the breathability of the air, we would be wasting our time because it's not CO2 that's the problem. CO2 is already low enough for us to breathe the air happily. It's other gases and particulate matter that's the problem. If you were to breathe in air which was 1.5% CO2, you would struggle within minutes. If you were to breathe in air that was 4% CO2, you would struggle within seconds. And if you were to breathe in air that was 10% CO2, you would be unconscious very quickly. And even if you were to start breathing in fresh air very quickly afterwards, you may not wake up from the damage that the CO2 would have done. So if it's not about CO2, what is London's ULEZ targeting? Well, primarily it's NOx, which are nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter, tiny little particles that can get into your body. Research shows breathing in higher levels of nitrogen oxides and particulate matter is harmful to human health. It can affect lung development in children, it can cause asthma, it can increase the chances of respiratory infections and many other respiratory illnesses. Reducing the levels of NOx and particulate matter that we breathe makes the air more breathable. It's estimated that breathing in higher levels of nitrogen oxide and particulate matter contribute to thousands of premature deaths per year. And this is where it gets confusing, because this drinks a lot of fuel, especially around town, and it produces a lot of CO2. So you would assume that it produces a lot of all the other gases as well, but it doesn't, because it's a petrol. Petrol vehicles historically had to pass much tougher emission standards than diesels when it comes to NOx. This vehicle has two whopping great big catalytic converters in the exhaust. I looked up how much they cost actually, £3,500 each. That's scary. Hopefully I don't need to replace one of those. Whereas diesel vehicles in the past, they have been subjected to far less strict NOx emissions guidelines. So they didn't have to get NOx as low to pass the emission standards. And to give you an idea of how different, a Euro 4 petrol has the same NOx emission standards as a Euro 6 diesel. Literally, diesel vehicles were 10 years behind when it comes to reducing NOx emissions. It is true, the way they test the cars did change over the years, but the discrepancy is still vast. So you can have a vehicle that uses a lot of fuel and produces a lot of CO2, but produces very minimal NOx and particulate matter. And you can have another vehicle that uses very little fuel and produces less CO2, but emits a high level of NOx and a high level of particulate matter. And when it comes to car manufacturers, when they want to lower NOx and when they want to lower particulate matter, in doing so, they usually increase CO2 and increase fuel consumption a bit. That is the price in lowering NOx and lowering particulate matter. That's why it's possible, and some people do this, it's possible to tune your car in a way where it would use less fuel and would produce less CO2. But in doing so, you're likely going to be increasing particulate matter and NOx. When it comes to emissions, it's not as simple as emissions. You have CO2 emissions and then you have everything else. Euro emission standards, they look at everything else. And then CO2, well, that's what gets taxed. To tax this car for a year, it's over £400. That's quite a lot of money. And because it uses a lot of fuel and producing CO2 is a direct consequence of using more fuel, I pay more fuel duty. I'm putting more fuel in the car. Fuel is heavily taxed, so I'm paying tax on that fuel. And if you were to buy a new car that produces a lot of CO2, you pay a lot more tax for your first year. If your car produces over 255 grams of CO2, first year tax is over £5,500 now. So yes, CO2 is taxed as well, it's just taxed at a different time. Many people think ULEZ is unfair, and I agree. In fact, I would go as far as to say it's a kick in the teeth, because in the 2000s, the government was incentivizing us to buy vehicles that were fuel efficient and emitted less CO2. Generally, these were diesels, and diesels had a lower emission standard for NOx, so it was easier to make them more fuel efficient. I was one of the people that bought these cars. I bought a used diesel in 2008 and a new diesel in 2010, and I thought, good, I'm using less fuel, I'm emitting less CO2, although I was always suspicious because when I started up that diesel in the garage, I had to get it out pretty quick before it started to make me feel ill. And then the government realised they had done something wrong. They were making the air more toxic from their incentive. And they didn't stand up and go, sorry, we've made an error here. We've incentivised you to buy these vehicles that are more fuel efficient, but actually the gas that is coming out the exhaust is more harmful to human health. We kind of need to reduce the number of these vehicles on the road to try and clean up the air. No, they didn't do that. They were just silent and then started charging people for using that car they incentivized. So I'm all for cleaning up the air and for getting rid of vehicles that produce gases that are directly harmful to human health. I'm definitely all for that. But I think there needs to be a more fair way of doing it than they have done it, considering it was their error. Some people say there should just be an outright ban on these cars if they're so harmful. You have a vehicle that's harmful to human health, you can still drive it, just pay £12.50 a day. Sounds dodgy, doesn't it? Doesn't make much sense. But when you consider how disruptive an outright ban would be, then it makes sense not to have an outright ban. Think of used vehicle values that are not ULEZ compliant if there was an outright ban, and how much more money people would have to spend to go from a vehicle that isn't ULEZ compliant to a car that is ULEZ compliant. So an outright ban is not really going to help many people. It might clean up the air a bit more quickly, but then charging people to use the vehicles can mean they raise money, which they do, about £250 million a year, which then can be put back into London's transport system to make it better, and maybe that can improve air quality as well. But in doing so, they are still charging people to use a car that they incentivized to be on the road, which is unfair. Can you think of a way to have ULEZ to reduce the number of vehicles that are producing high levels of NOx and particulate matter without actually charging people and without costing the taxpayer? Why don't you let us know in the comments? I understand that used values for vehicles that are not ULEZ compliant were significantly affected due to being charged to drive them in the ULEZ area, but I think most of us can agree that if there was an outright ban, the used value of vehicles that are not ULEZ compliant would have been affected a lot more, and they would have been worth even less. If you found the video interesting, please give it a thumbs up, and if you're looking for car insurance, check out the links to Collingwood and Confused in the description. If you're learning to drive and want to insure yourself on somebody else's car, then Collingwood are there for you, because you can do so without affecting the owner's policy, and that takes away a big stress from the owner of the car that you are using to practice your driving in. Via the link at the moment, it's up to 35% off and a £20 gift card. If you want to insure your own car, I recommend checking out the link to confused.com, because you fill out one quote form and get loads of quotes back from many insurers to compare who's cheapest, and you can change your car on that quote as many times as you like without having to do the whole quote again. So it's a quick and easy way to compare how much it costs to insure different cars. Very useful if you're shopping around for cars. Using the links doesn't cost you anything, but it does support the channel, so thank you very much. Subscribe to get my future videos, and until the next one, cheerio.